بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا ومن يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So we're back with the history of the rightly guided caliphs, Tarikh Khulafa Rashidin, and we're going to talk about one of the most challenging subjects, and that is the schism between Ali and Muawiyah radiyallahu anhuma. And this includes the battle of the Camel and Siffin. And this is the 9th lecture in our series. Assalamu alaikum ya tullab al-ilm, ahlan wa sahlan. So today we're talking about al-fitna al-kubra. And when I was in Egypt, I went to a market that they called Suq al-Azbakiyya, and there they have a very famous book market, and I saw this book, Al-Fitna Al-Kubra, which caught my eye. You know, this cool battle scene that's on the cover, and I thought, ooh, I need to get that. Because I knew that Al-Fitna Al-Kubra, it refers to the schism that happened during Ali's reign, radiyallahu anhu, between him and Muawiyah, radiyallahu anhuma, which is a very contentious and interesting time period. And then once I had brought it to my apartment there in Cairo, back in the neighborhood of Muhandisin where I used to live, I realized that the author, it says Dr. Taha Hussein. And I got even more excited because Taha Hussein, I think probably by common knowledge, he's known as a modernist, reformer, father of the Nahda, or the modernization project that took place in Egypt. And you'll learn more about that if you take the class on Islamic political history that I will be teaching in the fall, inshallah. We'll learn much more about Dr. Taha Hussein, but I want to give you a little overview right now. So he's got this really famous book called Al-Ayyam, or The Days, which is his autobiography. So if you don't know how to read Arabic, I highly recommend that you at least check out his autobiography, The Days, from American University of Cairo Press. I've actually been to their store there at the American University of Cairo at Tahrir Square and seen this book on the bookshelves over there. I read his autobiography. It's a really fantastic story. And I relate a lot with this guy. You know, he looks like an eccentric, intelligent professor. If you notice in both pictures, he's wearing sunglasses because he was blind. And he just was highly intelligent. He came from a village, more like a lower class. He studied at a madrasa in his village, you know, with like the local Quran teacher. He got admission to Al-Azhar University, and he details studying at Azhar and what that was like in the, you know, early 1900s. And He then got to listen to classes being taught, Near Eastern history classes at Jamaat al-Qahira. And Jamaat al-Qahira, in English, is called Cairo University. It's very prestigious. It's not as prestigious as Ain Shams University, but it's up there. I also got a chance to see that campus while I was in Egypt, and a lot of my Arabic teachers had graduated from Jama'at al-Qahira, excuse me, in what's called the Darul Ulum department, which is Arabic literature and Islamic studies combined, which really in the classical period is how it often was. The ulama were experts of literature. That's why, Imam Shafi'i, for instance, wrote tons and tons of poetry. Ibn Hazm wrote all kinds of very interesting literature, like his books As-Sadaqa, and besides As-Sadaqa, he had Tawqa al-Hamama, all those kinds of good stuff. And, everyone read like Kalila wa Dimna, Majnun wa Layla, all those types of literature story. All the ulama were familiar with them and referenced them even in religious texts. So, al-adab, or al-adab, the knowledge of literature, was considered a knowledge that all ulama had to know. And ulama liked to show off their intellectualism and their knowledge more broadly, not just with religious topics per se. And it's also interesting to note that in the modern period, in the West specifically, in Europe and America, you had this distinction between religious and secular. Whereas in Arabic, pre-modern Islamic world, we just have deen. We don't have this separation. And so there was no separation between religious and non-religious literature. Literature was literature. And anyways, getting back to Taha Hussein, he got his bachelor's degree in Islamic studies from Al-Azhar University. And he was shadowing some classes at Jamiat Qahira in history, and he decided he wanted to become an Islamic historian. And he got his PhD from the University of Cairo in 1914 on a figure who was also blind, historical figure who was blind. His name is Al-Ma'ari. Al-Ma'ari was a early medieval 11th century Gregorian vegan. He was an Islamic vegan and wrote about Islamic veganism. And he was also a philosopher. He came from a Shi'i background. So if you take my class in the fall on Islamic political history, we will do a small reading on Al-Ma'ari, because he was just considered very influential literature, writer. And then Taha Hussein, in the tradition of many Azhari graduates, went to get his PhD in Europe. And so he went to Sorbonne in France, which is like their Harvard, extremely prestigious university, where in just 3 years later, in 1917, he got his PhD in history as well. So he's got 2 PhDs now. And he specialized in the historiography of Ibn Khaldun, like we read during the first week. And so then, shortly thereafter, 2 years, which is pretty amazing, he was appointed professor of history at Cairo University, his alma mater. So he's much more of a complex figure than someone who's just a modernizer. He was an Islamic scholar to the highest degree, who was trying to figure out a way to adapt Islam to the modern period, which they call fiqh al-waqi'. And he wanted to bring historical knowledge of the Islamic tradition in order to find tools to deal with modern problems, what they call nawazil, or, al-fiqh al-mu'asir, like, contemporary fiqh issues. Um, and like I mentioned, he was blind, so he had people read to him all of his textbooks and everything like that, and that is how he became a professor, got his 2 PhDs, which is pretty amazing. It's pretty rare for people to do that nowadays. One modern example that I can think of is Slavoj Žižek, who is an expert on ideology and psychology. So yeah, that's Taha Hussein, who is an expert on Al-Fitna Al-Kubra. I have the book actually right here. Let me just show you how thick it is. And it starts with the reign of Uthman and goes all the way until the assassination of Ali and a little beyond. And he gives his own historical analysis of it. He believes that the Saba'iyya did not exist. He doesn't trust Saif bin Umar in that regard. But yeah, just brilliant luminary. His house still exists in, I believe it's Mantaqa al-Do'i, Hay al-Do'i in Cairo. So it's a museum. You can go visit it. Very interesting figure. So I'm just going to be doing audio here so that there's more space, for words so that you can study the slides. Don't really pay too much attention to the pictures. That's just supposed to be people giving bay'ah to whatever sheikh. Just, because we're going to be talking about bay'ah. And so when Ali was about to be elected, after Uthman was killed, radiyallahu anhuma, these proto-Kharijite or proto-Shiite, like confederation or whatever you want to call it, basically had control of the city of Medina during the chaos. But they needed, they knew they needed to eventually elect like a real caliph, according to the shurut, the requirements, the conditions of Sharia. And if you want to know more about that, you can read Al-Mawardi. He details from a Shari'i perspective and a cultural perspective as well, all the requirements to a Islamic ruler. If you take my class, history of Islamic polities, then we'll read some of Al-Mawardi, inshaAllah. The caliph has to be Hashimi. Some say just Qurashi, and so on and so forth. There's like various requirements, right? And usually shura is part of that requirement, but not always. Like everything in fiqh, there's difference of opinion. So Abdullah bin Saba, was part of the proto-Kharijite, proto-Shiite group, as I've mentioned before. And he approached Ali, Zubair, and Talha, but all of them refused to become caliph. The leader of this murderous confederation was Ghafiqi bin Harb al-Aqi. So Akka is in English they call acre, which I believe is like kind of where Syria and Turkey meet. I could be wrong about that, though. It might be more down in Palestine. But anyways, acre is the English term for that. So this guy was likely Ghassanid and definitely converted or was part of the Islamic conquests or maybe even converted after that, but not one of the senior Sahaba. And, he was there with Abdullah bin Saba. They came up with a plan to basically threaten the whole city of Medina that if they don't elect a caliph within a couple of days, then they would kill Ali, Zubair, and Talha. So they kind of like made them hostages, if you will, and the ransom was you got to elect somebody as caliph, one of these guys. Because everyone knew that it was just a matter of being between Ali, Zubair, and Talha. They're the senior most Sahaba. Everyone knew that, Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas had no interest in politics, and that Ammar bin Yasser, at that point he was like a very old man, I think like late 80s, maybe 90. So there wasn't that many viable options, if you will, for caliph. So it's just going to be between Ali, Zubair, and Talha. We have to remember that these companions were the younger companions. Even Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Abi Sufyan's generation, even he was a little bit younger than the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, if I remember correctly. And, Umar was probably around the same age as Abu Sufyan. And Uthman was younger than them both. And then Ali even younger. And so Ali, Zubair, Talha, Uthman are kind of like the youth, the younger generation. Ibn Mas'ud as well, but Ibn Mas'ud was more neutral in politics as well. He just wanted to focus on teaching Islam, much like Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas and others, Abdullah bin Umar and so on. And that's why, we have so many narrations, especially from Ibn Mas'ud and Abdullah ibn Umar in terms of fiqh and other things. They were fuqaha for sure, both of them. And so anyways, the main choices was Ali, Zubair, and Talha. Despite this, Zubair and Talha still refused to become caliph no matter, what. And so basically that only left Ali, and when he was approached by the people, he allowed them to give bay'ah he was reluctant about it, but he, under pressure, decided to do so because he probably thought that the people of Medina would actually be killed, because these people were, I guess you could say, overzealous, crazy maybe, mental illness, all kinds of issues, right? And so this happened 656, 35 after Hijrah. Malik al-Ashtar, he was a big lover of Ali, and so he was the first who pledged allegiance to Ali, and then the veterans of Badr pledged allegiance. So, this is something that kind of the senior Sahaba and Ansar did. They all pledged allegiance. Talha and Zubair also pledged allegiance on the promise, or on the condition, that Ali take retribution, qisas, upon the murderers of Uthman, which Ali agreed to. And Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas refused to give bay'ah. He wanted to stay neutral throughout the fitan. And Sa'd said to Ali, La alayka minni ba's. So you have nothing to worry about from me, essentially. And Ibn Sa'd, who's different than Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas, Ibn Sa'd, he was a famous historian. He's famous for his book Tabaqat Ibn Sa'd, where he not only details Sirah, it's one of the major narrations of Sirah, but also many of the later battles that happened during the Khulafa Rashidun, and I believe even a little after. And so he narrates that Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas actually did give the pledge of allegiance to Ali, as well as Usama ibn Maslama and that's supposed to say Zayn bin Thabit, I believe. Um, and we know that the vast majority of the Ansar pledged allegiance to Ali. They were his loyalists. Um, but the optics of all this was that Ali had large support from these protesters or rioters or whatever you want to call them, the people who caused the chaos in which Uthman was murdered. So in that sense, it looked suspect for Ali, for people who didn't actually know what happened in Medina. The people who were in these Amsar, garrison cities outside of the Arabian Peninsula. And so Abdullah bin Umar and Aisha did not consider Zubair's and Talha's pledges, as real shura. So I don't know what they wanted out of shura. It's not clear from the historical sources. If you find it in your research for your final paper, you can bring it to my attention. It was unclear what kind of a shura they wanted, but they didn't accept that as a shura. Zubair was a relative of Aisha, so maybe she just simply wanted him to be the next caliph. Allahu a'lam bis-sawab. But Abdullah bin Umar said to Ali, "Fear God and do not jump upon the rule of the ummah without a consultation, mushawara." And then he left to Mecca to join the opposition to Ali with Aisha. And so Mecca was basically where all of the people who were suspect of Ali, or suspect of this new political arrangement that happened very quickly and chaotically, they all coalesced in Mecca basically to form a rebellion. So in Ali's early caliphate, radiyallahu anhu, he had done a few actions here. Taha Hussein was of the opinion that all of this occurred, the rioting and murder of Uthman, because these hardened Arab warriors who had known nothing but conquest and pillaging on the front lines, they call the Thur, they were Juyush al-Murabita. They were these armies or battalions or whatever you want to call it that were stationed on the front lines. They knew nothing but battle. Since the time of Abu Bakr with the Ridda Wars. And suddenly, during the time of Uthman, they found themselves relatively idle in the Amsar, the garrison cities, predominantly Mosul, which refers to Fustat, Kufa, and Basra in Iraq. And because they were kind of sitting idle, they became preoccupied with domestic affairs. And just like in Al-Jahiliyyah, they knew nothing but violence and warfare as they participated in, the Islamic conquests. And they, only knew to use violence to resolve problems, and were battle hardened. Likely they had, things like PTSD or whatever from the brutalities of war. And they marched as armies. These are military veterans. That's what they know. They marched as armies to Medina and did what they did to the Sahaba there. And these were all predominantly new converts to Islam who didn't have much knowledge. So got to keep all those factors in mind when talking about Uthman's murder and Ali's ascension to the caliphate. And so Ali had ordered these three contingencies to leave Medina, but they refused his order even though they claimed to be his strongest supporters and had just elected him as caliph. And, there's no sami'na wa ta'na attitude with them. They flat out refused the Caliph's orders. And on the third or fourth day of being Caliph, Ali deposed all of Uthman's governors to install his own trustworthy governors, since all of them were from Bani Umayyah. Al-Mughira bin Shu'bah was worried that Muawiyah would take offense to this, because Muawiyah was one of those governors, and suspect Ali was behind the killing of Uthman, to which Ali replied, "I shall straighten out Muawiyah with my sword and make no concessions." And Ibn Abbas had agreed with Ali regarding that, according to one narration. And meanwhile, in Damascus, Muawiyah had Uthman's bloody shirt on display at the Grand Mosque of Damascus to provoke the people. It's also said that the 3 fingers of Uthman's wife, Na'ilah, that had been cut off during the murder were also displayed. And the Amsar, meaning Al-Misr, Kufa, and Basra, were swirling with all kinds of crazy conjectural rumors regarding Uthman's murder. They really had no concrete, reliable reports as to what was going on in the capital in Medina. They just knew that Uthman had been killed and didn't know much else. Ma'arika al-Jamal, so the Battle of the Camel. And if you see the picture in the upper right corner here, Aisha was sitting atop the camel there, and this is a depiction of the camel's hamstrings, that is the muscles on the back of its legs being cut, which forces the animal to then collapse. Same thing will happen if you cut the hamstrings of a human. And so in Mecca, Aisha radiallahu anha was rallying the people, saying that Ali was responsible for Uthman's death. Many prominent Qurayshis began leaving Medina to gather in Mecca, like I mentioned before, in order to, I guess, start a rebellion, if you will. Meanwhile, Ali wanted to secure Muawiyah's bay'ah, in Syria, right? Because that was kind of like the only major political force who still hadn't really given Ali bay'ah. However, Ibn Abbas, that's Abdullah ibn Abbas, the author of the famous Tafsir Ibn Abbas, which I have here at home. And so in Tafsir Ibn Abbas, there's also some very interesting narrations about Sirah and the Khulafa Rashidun and all that kind of stuff. So if you read Arabic, or you know of some translation, that might be a historical source you could cite for your final paper. So Ibn Abbas said, "You know that Muawiyah and his friends are people of this world," meaning the dunya. They're, you might say in modern terminology, as secular, or that they're only concerned with political aspirations or money and power, essentially. So Ibn Abbas continues, "If you confirm them, they'll not care who is reigning. But if you depose them, they will say, 'He has seized the rule without shura and has killed our companion.' They will stir up the opposition against you. The people of Syria and Iraq will then mutiny against you. I am not sure that Talha and Az-Zubair will not turn around to attack you." Yet Ali refused to keep Muawiyah as governor. He definitely wanted him out of that political position so he could appoint his own person there. And then this was mainly due to Muawiyah's, dunyawi, like worldly nature. And he, Ali would rather meet Muawiyah with the sword, which he stated many times. So that was that. That was Ali's ijtihad and that issue. And basically what Abdullah ibn Abbas was saying was, that Muawiyah just cares about political power. And as long as you keep him as governor in Syria, he doesn't care who the caliph is. He just wants to have his power over Syria. And Omar was said not to have wanted to appoint Ali to caliph because of Ali's lack of political pragmatism, or his political naivete, if you will. Or Ali was just an idealist trying his best to uphold the Sharia and prevent the Dunyawi Umayyads from taking power. I mean, these are both simultaneously true in my eyes. And those who tried to leave Muawiyah's domain to join Ali were often captured, imprisoned, and or killed, such as Ibn Abi Hudhayfa. Mecca went into full rebellion against Ali, who could not regain control of the city of Mecca. And Aisha was in command of the Meccans, who were weighing their options. Do they attack Medina when they're much weaker militarily? Do they run away to seek refuge with Muawiyah and Marawin? They decided Muawiyah likely would not support a new shura, because they knew that Muawiyah just wanted basically to have power for himself. So they opted to travel to Basra in hopes that Abu Musa al-Ash'ari or somebody there would support them. Little did they know, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari actually went to Kufa to, talk with the people of Kufa during that time. Money was raised to get Aisha an armor-clad battle camel, which she rode to Basra. Talha and Az-Zubair were among her soldiers. Like I had mentioned before, that Marwan bin al-Hakam had immediately left Medina and gone to Syria. There are other narrations actually that I found that said that Marwan went to Mecca and followed Aisha's group, if you will, and went along with them to Basra. And people say, oh, well, Aisha's al Mu'mineen, Ummahat. She's, like the mother of the believers and the mother of the mothers, right? And they saw this as like a major detraction from, Ali's political authority, if you will. But it's important to note that there were other mothers of the believers, or other, wives of the Prophet ﷺ, radiyallahu anhuna, where they supported Ali. So Salama sent her son Umar bin Abi Salama al-Makhzumi, which is a clan of Quraysh, to fight for Ali's army. And then Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas, even though some narrations say he remained neutral, his nephew Hashim bin Utbah bin Abi Waqqas, Utbah actually converted to Islam before Sa'd, if I remember correctly, but he was martyred in, I can't remember if it was Badr or Uhud, but it was one of them. And so this was, the son of Sa'd's brother Utbah, and so he joined with Ali. And of course, Ibn Abbas was with Ali, as well as Muhammad bin Abi Bakr, the son of Abu Bakr, right? So there was very prominent Sahaba that went with Ali, including Ammar bin Yasir. And then Malik al-Ashtar was also, like I said, a strong supporter of Ali and went with. He was also a very brilliant military commander. So there was that aspect to this group here that what they call Shi'at Ali. So Shia, the literal meaning is that Shaya or Sha'a is to spread something. Shia, with the ta marbuta at the end, it means like a party or partisans, or some type of group that's rallied behind a figurehead. So you had Shi'at Ali, Shi'at Aisha, and Shi'at Muawiyah. But the term Shia, stuck until our modern times now, where we know them as this separate sect of Islam, if you will. But it all harkens back to these events. And so, like I mentioned here, Marawin had, according to some narrations, gone with Aisha. And during the chaos of the battle of the Camel, which they both, two different armies, this is Aisha's army going from Mecca up to Basra, and Ali's army going up to Basra. They met just outside of Basra and had this battle known as the Battle of the Camel. Marwan, in the chaos of that battle, killed Talha intentionally for reasons that are not completely known. Publicly, Marwan stated that he wanted to get revenge for Uthman on Shi'at Aisha, which, is plausible, but more likely, given the nature that we know of the Umayyads to their own, statements, they were probably trying to remove a rival to Umayyad rule. And that's what both Talha and Zubair were. Marwan probably, if he had the chance, would have killed Zubair and Aisha as well. And that just shows you, for Marwan and Muawiyah, they had concerns that were not particularly religious in nature, or they didn't respect the status of the senior Sahaba like they properly should have, is what I'm trying to say. And so Ibn az-Zubair, Zubair's son, who becomes very important for later Islamic history as he creates his own caliphate and has a significant claim and rebellion against the Umayyads, and fights Marwan and Marwan's son for quite some time. So basically, the schism that started with Ali, it lasted beyond Ali's time, beyond Muawiyah's time, all the way to the Marwanid Umayyads. But it was Abdul Malik bin Marwan who I think finally stomped out Ibn az-Zubair's rebellion, and he also was responsible indirectly for Abdullah bin Umar's death, but we'll get into that in the Islamic political history class. So anyways, Ibn az-Zubair was fatally wounded. He was struck in the head with a sword, but he actually ended up surviving. Some of the artistic depictions of warfare during the time of the Prophet ﷺ and Khulafa Rashidun are simply wrong. Very wrong, often. So, even if one takes just a cursory look at the hadith corpus, Sitta as-Sahiha, the 6 canonical hadith books, or even just more concisely, if one takes a look at the book Ash-Shama'il Muhammadiyya by Imam at-Tirmidhi, the Muhammadan characteristics, if you will, that book details, among other places, the type of armor, dur'a is what it's called in Arabic, the type of armor, cuirass that the Prophet ﷺ wore, his mighfirah, which is, they call a male coif, which is like this chainmail that goes around the head and neck that the Prophet ﷺ wore. They had metal helmets, they had metal armor, chainmail and armor. They weren't running around in just leather armor or rags or radat or izar or whatever, qamis, whatever things people are thinking. No, they had full metal armor. All right. Steel was available during this time. Okay. It wasn't the Bronze Age. And so, I imagine here that Ibn az-Zubair was struck with a sword in the head, but that he was wearing a metal helmet. So maybe he had gotten a concussion, it knocked him unconscious, and it maybe cut part of his head or face or something. But he survived, and he survived without any clear mental illness of any kind. So he didn't have brain damage, in other words. So likely it was probably some sort of concussion or something, got knocked unconscious or something, and the person thought he was dead and left him to die. But he didn't die, he survived. And his father, Az-Zubair, was killed in battle, defending Aisha, defending the camel. And Ali ordered his soldiers to hamstring the camel. That means, like I said, cut the back of the legs where the hamstring muscles are. And, the camel collapsed and the battle was essentially over because now they had captured Aisha, al-Mu'mineen, who was the military leader. She was elderly at that time. She had taken a arrow to her upper arm, but it was a minor injury. They pulled out the arrow there and she didn't bleed out or anything crazy. After a few days of resting, Ali had banished her to leave Basra, and I think she returned to either Mecca or Medina, and just continued her life as a religious scholar teaching. And she taught a lot of her knowledge to Ibn az-Zubair, among others. And in a sense, she was kind of maybe ostracized isn't the right word, but she had it seemed like a lower status amongst the Sahaba after that, in a sense, because of this rebellion. Like Abdullah ibn Abbas and others didn't really treat her with the respect that she was used to previously. When they kicked her out, like they entered upon her, the place she was staying, like her room, without her permission and told her, you have to leave. So it was kind of a curt, blunt way of saying, like, you're banished. And Aisha was very shocked by that. Very shocked by that. And at the end of the battle, Ali said, no one turning his back shall be pursued. No one wounded shall be killed. Whoever throws away his arms is safe. And this is a pretty radical thing to say in those days, because with medieval battle, this is, you could say, the late antique, early medieval period here. It's kind of right at that line of transition. With medieval battle, like I said, where people are armor clad and they have swords or spears or things like that, arrows, the likelihood of, it's really kind of hard actually to penetrate the armor. You could swing your sword really hard at your opponent and not, the armor fully protects them. So often what would happen is the armies would clash, and it would be like a shoving match where they would shove each other, push each other, and then maybe be able to, like, cut someone's neck under their male koif, under their mighfara, or cut them under the arm, like the armpit area was one place that usually wasn't protected by armor, or the groin area, things like that. Somehow where they could get a dagger, knife, or sword, or whatever it may be, the what do you call it, the pike, the spear, in those weak points of the armor where they could kill people. But that was kind of hard to do because everyone shoved against each other very closely and intensely. Some people actually would die from suffocation. I'm a Muslim convert, so I mean, my frame of reference in my mind is a mosh pit at like a heavy metal concert where people really push up against each other. And then eventually one side would retreat, would kind of be running away, and it was upon the army running away that they would often be slaughtered. They would just be killed, because the back region wasn't as well protected by armor. So they could easily be hit, with swords, spears, arrows, what have you. And when people would run away, they would be more spread apart, so it would be easier to attack the weak points in their armor. Like hit the back of their neck with a sword, for instance, or what have you, right? And so when Ali said, "No one turning his back shall be pursued," and what you see often in classical Islamic sources, whether they be fiqh books or history books or whatever, is talaba, yatlubu, matlub, talib, referring to warfare. The one who is chasing and the one who is chased as being really significant factors in warfare. So I just wanted to highlight that phrase and kind of its historical context, because that might be difficult for modern people to understand. So after the Battle of the Camel, wasn't too long that you had the Battle of Siffin, Ma'arikat Siffin. So Siffin is an area outside of modern, or outside at that time of Raqqa. Now it's within modern day Raqqa, over around here. So Battle of the Camel was down here, and from Kufa, Ali's army marched up to Syria to confront Muawiyah, but this was after a long time of negotiations, failed negotiations. And this was a thing. This was really difficult for the Ummah to endure. And frankly, after the Battle of the Camel being so, I guess you could say, scandalous to the Ummah, and the murder of Uthman being so scandalous to the Ummah, that, they were really reluctant to go into battle. Maybe a modern example you can think of is like, America was super reluctant to join World War I, had this isolationist America First policy, even more reluctant to join World War II. We didn't really join it until we were attacked by Japan with Pearl Harbor. And here, the Ummah had this huge kind of reluctance to fight a war. And it's ironic with the West, they were so reluctant to fight one another. Everyone was reluctant to stop Hitler from taking Sudetenland for Lebensraum and these things. It wasn't until he invaded Poland that they got all excited. But they still had colonies all over, and they were so quick to have any type of warfare with non-Western peoples. They were happy to be colonizers, but not happy to fight one another. But here, the Muslims were fighting one another, and so they were very reluctant to fight each other, period. And the Battle of Siffin was known as the most bloody and difficult of battles during the time of the Khulafa Rashidun. Some might even argue during all of Islamic history. It was a nasty battle. And, Ibn Khaldun, he says, take numbers with a grain of salt, but it's estimated that 100,000 Muslims died in this battle. And that's pretty significant for the time period. Let's see if I can just Google on my phone quick what the world population was in the 7th century. So 7th century world population. Let's see if there's any estimates. So it was only 208 million people. And imagine we have billions of people nowadays. So that's not even 1 billion. So wow. I'm not a math whiz, but for the math whizzes that are out there, we have 7 billion people on Earth right now, so they say. So how many 200 millions can go into that? I think that's 5 per million. So 5 times 7 is going to be a lot. Basically, 100,000 people was a good chunk of people for that time. that's important to keep into consideration. Maybe 100,000 doesn't sound so significant to us nowadays, but it's a lot. You can look up how many American soldiers were killed in the Iraq War and the Afghan War, and these things. You realize that 100,000 is a lot more than most modern wars, at least recent ones. And so Wilfred Madelung, he says, fighting Muslim opponents in regular battle was a new experience in Islam. Ali could have treated his opponents on Abu Bakr's precedent as apostates and infidels, and thus applied the common rules of warfare to them. However, Ali was not a man of that character and did not want to openly excommunicate, make takfir upon his opponents. The Prophet ﷺ said, when a man calls his brother an unbeliever, a kafir, it returns at least to one of them, meaning one of those two people, either the person making takfir or the person who takfir is made upon is a disbeliever. So it's risky if you make takfir on somebody else and you're not fully certain of their kufr. And I mean really, truly certain and knowledgeable about all the shurut and all the fiqh and all the, things where you could make that kind of ruling, and you yourself are a faqih, a mufti, or whatever. Like, there's a significant chance that you may be the actual disbeliever. So it's something you can't do, or you can't take very lightly, rather. And Ali, was remembering that hadith where, either the accused is as claimed or the charge will return against the accuser. And this is in Sahih al-Bukhari, among other places. And so despite Muawiyah's superior army, his claim to the caliphate was very weak, as I've detailed. He was a taliq. His merit was way below the sabiqeen al-awwaleen, al-mustad'afeen. And that the sabiqeen al-awwaleen is like a seerah term that refers to the earliest, foremost companions, the first converts. The mustad'afeen refers to those early converts who were weak. They did not have a tribe to really protect them. Abdullah bin Mas'ud was a hadith, so he was in that position. Bilal bin Rabah was a freed slave, a mawla, so he was in that position as well. Ammar bin Yasir was in that position, as his mother was black and I think she was actually still a slave or recently freed or something like that. And then his father Yasir was a Halif from Yemen. So I mean, these were people who didn't necessarily have clans or tribes to protect them. So they were basically more or less left to fend for themselves. Khabab ibn al-Arat was like that as well. And then, of course, after that, you have the Muhajirin, the immigrants, who made either the Hijratain, first to Abyssinia, then to Medina, or just to Medina. And Al-Aws wal-Khazraj, i.e. the Ansar, the helpers, people who brought victory. And so, their merit was way higher than any of the Tulaqa, such as Abu Sufyan and Hind, who were his parents. Remember, Hind is the one who wanted Hamza dead, Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib, and had Wahshi kill Hamza, and she took a bite out of Hamza's liver, I believe it was. So she was a little cuckoo in that moment, if you could say so. She's very famously portrayed in the Arabic film Ar-Risala, which they have like an English version called The Message. 1972, I believe, was the year it came out. And of course, she's portrayed in that series Silsilat Umar from, I think it's called MBC. So you can check those out as well. But yeah, so his parents was Abu Sufyan and Hind. He was hardly anywhere near in rank to the senior Sahaba, and being a tariq that automatically excluded him from sitting on any kind of shura council or anything like that. And a lot of historical reports suggest that Uthman actually meant very little to Muawiyah. They didn't really care for each other all that much. Muawiyah was governor of Syria before Uthman got there, if I remember correctly. During Omar's time, he took over Syria after his brother Yazid died from the plague. So I don't think Muawiyah and Uthman really had a whole lot of contact. But Muawiyah used the rhetoric of getting revenge for Uthman, qisas, to rally his troops and maintain political power. And it is very true that, in Arab tribal society, getting qisas for your clan or tribe was a very serious thing, even if you didn't really have a relationship with the person who was murdered from your tribe. So, like I said, a lot of times both things can be simultaneously true in history. We shouldn't oversimplify things in history or oversimplify people's motivations. And that's why if you look at the stack behind me right here, these are mostly all psychology books, psychoanalysis. Because I feel like having a deep understanding of human psychology, for like ilm al-nafs is what it's traditionally called in Islamic traditional psychology, and then also beyond that I study Western psychology. I feel like the knowledge of the way people think helps you understand their motivations. So when you do history, you can understand why it is that they made certain decisions or behaved in certain ways. And so, like I said, it's important not to oversimplify people's motivations. At best, most of the time, what we can say is Allahu A'lam. We don't know all the details of these people's lives, and that's why we have husnul dhan and assume the best about them, and that's why we don't disassociate as Sunnis from any one of them, because only Allah knows, and we will only get the real truth about these events on Judgment Day. That is to say that there's still, high probability that such and such thing happened, or, so on and so forth. So you can have your opinion about what took place historically, but we have to know that an opinion is not the same as absolute certainty and haqq al-yaqeen, right? So anyways, basically, Muawiyah considered the Levant, Sham, to be Umayyad hereditary property, and after sending multiple letters to one another, corresponding, trying to negotiate, Muawiyah and Ali could not come to any resolution whatsoever, and war became inevitable. They both personally led their armies to the area of Siffin. Ammar bin Yasser was killed in the Battle of Siffin. I believe he was about 90 years old, so he, more than like a combatant, he was like a military general leading and commanding, but he was killed, and he is buried at Siffin, which is within modern Raqqa's city limits. With all the events that happened with Daesh, I'm not sure if that gravesite is still intact, or if they still know where it is, or any of those things. Allahu A'lam. Maybe some of you can do research on that. After sending multiple letters, I just said that, sorry. So when Ali's army arrived to this area of Siffin, Muawiyah's soldiers, they were already there naturally because it's a shorter distance from Damashq to Siffin than Kufa, and they blocked their access to water, Al-Furat, the Euphrates, which was considered like, access to water was considered like sacrosanct to the Arabs. Blocking like a well or river or something like that was just seen as absolutely reprehensible under any conditions, violation of all ethical standards, no matter how evil you might think your enemy is. And frankly, the army of Ali was extremely mad and upset by this. Amongst them was the Saba'iyya, the followers of Abdullah bin Saba. And they basically, with all their fervor, anger, and might, attacked Muawiyah's army because they were thirsty. They had traveled all the way from Kufa. They needed water or they were going to die from dehydration. So with their thick, dehydrated blood in their veins, they attacked Muawiyah's soldiers in desperation and slaughtered them. I mean, they just slaughtered Muawiyah's army at that time, and where they were able to get the water to drink. And there was daily skirmishing, and the skirmishing lasted, and then they took a break for a month. I believe it was a month of Muharram. They went back to fighting, and then shortly thereafter, Muawiyah knew that he was losing. Ali's army was about to just completely decimate all of Muawiyah's army. I mean, they were at the verge of complete and total victory. And Muawiyah, as a way to try to buy time to get resupply his army and get reinforcements over to Siffin, he did this kind of a ruse or ploy where he commanded all of his pikesmen, all of his spearmen, to put the Quran, like Musahif, actual copies of the Quran. Musahif, we're not talking about the Uthmanic Codex here, as if you remember, it takes quite a lot of goats to be slaughtered just to make one book. But these were Musahif. They were like maybe sheets of parchment or other types of material where passages of Quran were written on, and they tied them to their spearheads so that way they were high up in the air where they could be, visibly seen. And they did that as an act of symbolism, in order to stop people from fighting, and demanded arbitration, tahkim, by the Quran. And this brought forth another period of negotiation between Muawiyah and Ali, and a cessation of hostilities. Although on Ali's side, in his camp, there was quite the debate as to a lot of the people on Ali's side wanted him to just push forward and completely wipe out Muawiyah's army and take Syria for himself. And Ali almost did this, but at the you might say at the last minute, or by just a slight margin, he made the decision to leave them, so there would be less bloodshed and enmity amongst the Muslims, because Islam is all about ikhwa or ukhuwa, brotherhood. And so they had a cessation of hostilities. However, another problem would arise for Ali radiyallahu anhum ajma'in, and that is the battle, the Ma'rika of Nahrawan. So if we look over here, Ma'rika Nahrawan, which happened later on and up in this area, and that is where Ali had to fight the Khawarij. And so we will get into that in the next lecture. Here is where I will end. Thank you very much for following me with this very contentious, serious topic. I ask that Allah give us understanding and beneficial knowledge. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.